Good evening. I'm glad you're all here today to check out the office hours. Hopefully I've got some students from last course and from this course, but if it's just from this course, I'm happy to. I hope you've all had a good couple of weeks. It's been weird not doing the office hours, but I was traveling. I worked the whole time, about 3 to 5 hours every day, but we went back out west where we lived for a long time in Washington State. Near Bellingham, and we sold our house, and so that was a big deal. But we also saw lots of friends and went on lots of hikes, and I turned 34, and it was just a really good time. And we took our almost 4-year-old for hikes for the first time. She actually did over a mile without any carrying, and the trick was to convince her that she was our teacher, which was fun. So yeah, I hope everyone else is having a pretty good summer. So I've got a lot of questions this week, so I'm just going to get into them. But I always like to share like one personal tidbit so you get to know me a little better, and I like to get to know you too. So always feel free to send me those sort of things. My first question this evening, the first 3 are actually from Margriet. It's a Dutch name. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. I'm sorry. And the first is, when do you seek permission from people who are characters in a memoir? And I think the best thing in terms of that is to wait until you have a publisher, because then you know you're going forward with it. You can show them the final copy so they can see what's actually going into print before you publish it, and they can see how they feel about it. It's much better to tell them in advance and let them look at it beforehand. Then find out afterwards how upset they are. And sometimes publishers have specific guidelines. So sometimes a publisher will say, oh, no, don't do that. But most of the time, they'll encourage that, and they'll want that to happen beforehand. So yeah, that is definitely a factor. And the second question is, do you recommend following an agent on Twitter as you approach them with a query? And I think it's definitely good to do that. I think you learn a lot about how agents think by following even agents you're not particularly interested in on Twitter. There's a lot of information out there, and I'm not particularly fond of Twitter, but it's an incredible resource. And the person, Margriet, actually suggested that there would be, like, there's other places to follow agents like Facebook, but Twitter really is the best in terms of publishing for both agents and publishers. The quality of information on there is really hard to like navigate, but it's excellent. Like, there's lots of publishers, like larger ones, that are open to direct submissions, and the only ways you can find out is through these limited time period releases that they do on Twitter. For example, some sci-fi publishers are like this, and some other ones too, I'm sure. And so some agents will even be like this. Like, they'll be like, oh, right now I'm seeking pitches about this. Send it here and I'll look at it right away, that sort of thing. So it's really helpful to follow agents in that way, even though personally I'm not terribly comfortable with it. 3, when do you respond to emailed rejections? Like, if they're personal or if they're just formal and mass. I only respond to emailed rejections if they're personal. If they're just mass submissions, it's not going to help to receive a response. It's not going to help the person who sent it. They might not even see it. It might be automatically set out to filter it out. And it's not going to help you really either. I think one of the things that is a problem nowadays with rejections, and I mean, it's not always a problem, most people aren't like this, is that often I'll reject someone, say from Authors Published, and I won't cite any particular in-depth reasons because I don't think I need to, because the work didn't speak for itself. If the work is good or close to being accepted, I'll spell out why I rejected it. If it's just really clearly not right for us, I'll just give it a mass rejection. And people will write me back and say, you owe me a personal rejection. And the thing is, I don't. I wish I did, but I receive about 25 submissions to 30 per week. And that's just a small part of my job, to look through those submissions. And it's a small part of our newsletter, because most of the people who work with us have worked with us for a really long time. And so I don't have the time to personally respond to all those rejections. And I will really encourage if I think something's close. So you just have to take that into consideration, because I know that compared to most publishing companies, I don't receive that many submissions. Okay. Next is 4. But if it is a personal rejection, it's good to respond. And I can say this as an editor, and I can say this as someone who's responded to a personal rejection before from an agent. It is really good to sort of build that rapport if they personally reject you, if they go into detail. 3, because they took the time out to give you that personal rejection, so you can take the time out to respond to it, because it is really a compliment in a way. Okay, so the next question is from Susan Payne. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your last name right, but we've got a couple Susans at our class this year. So I wanted this course, and so I wanted to specify which one. The question is, how do you tell different publishers when submitting your manuscript that is currently under review at another publisher? And so what you do, and you don't always have to do this, I don't think. If they ask you to inform them if it's a simultaneous submission, inform them. If they don't ask you, don't mention it. That's fine. If they say they don't allow it, don't do it. Follow their rules within reason. Like if they take a year to respond, I think it's kind of within your rights to submit somewhere else, but that's a personal moral call. But I do know that all the authors I know do that. But in my experience, what you do if they ask to be informed, if you're submitting elsewhere, is to say this is a simultaneous submission. And that just means you're submitting it elsewhere also. And you don't have to list where you're submitting it or how many other places. You just say this is a simultaneous submission. Or this manuscript is being simultaneously submitted elsewhere. So they know that this is a personalized letter. I mean, and the rest of the details should be personalized, but it is that the actual concrete body of your work is being considered by other publications, other publishers, other agents. Some, and I've noticed this more recently, some agents ask that you don't directly submit to publishers while submitting to agents. But that they're fine with you submitting to other agents simultaneously, but not other publishers. So I thought that was interesting. I hadn't noticed that historically. I think it's more of a newer development within the last 2 years, but I might be wrong. So the next question is from Phil Taylor. And I think I was so nervous that I had so many questions that I've been going through them way too fast. So I'm going to slow down a little. And I actually do have 2 more questions from Marguerite, but I'm going to answer them via email because they're easier to answer that way. And they're not pertinent to a lot of other people. But they're good questions. So Phil Taylor asks whether we should be using the services of a professional editor rather than relying on our own skills. And so I think this is a really good question to ask. And I do talk about it a lot in the first week. I think it is really great to use a professional editor because you're never going to catch all of your own mistakes. We're kind of blind to our own mistakes, and we grow more blind to them over time. It's easier to notice other people's errors than our own. And the problem with this is that, in fact, if you have like a spouse that could edit your work, which I do, they also grow blind to your mistakes over time, and they become more immune to them. So if you have a long-term editing partner or something like that that you exchange work with, it doesn't always work over time. It is really good, even if you find a really great editor, and I've found a number of them, to switch them up every manuscript, because they will become, over time, less capable of spotting your mistakes because they become normalized. They begin to expect them. They begin to see them as correct instead of incorrect. And so I really highly recommend shifting editors over time, which isn't common advice, but in my experience has been really beneficial. And different people notice different aspects of your work and pick up on different errors that you make and different possibilities for expanding things. I think one of the important distinctions is this idea of copy editor versus content editor, whereas a copy editor is just looking for mistakes. A content editor is also looking for opportunities to make your work better. And I really think it's good to get one of both if you can afford it. And if you're really pretty confident with the level of mistakes you make, get a content editor, because they'll still spot major copy editing mistakes, but their focus will really be on making your work the best it could possibly be. So it's kind of difficult to find a good content or copy editor. I don't think that it's one size fits all. Like the best copy editor or content editor for me is probably not going to be the best copy or content editor for you. It depends on your mistakes. For example, I tend to be too brief. I don't tend to describe things long enough. And so it's good for me to get someone who encourages that. Whereas other people, other writers need people to come in and trim the fat and take the extra words out. And I think because I am a poet and have been for many years, I am much more likely to trim too much fat out just while writing it. And like maybe some of the good skin and the good meat, that's my problem. So knowing your own faults and knowing to look for a content or copy editor that works with that can really help. And one of the things I suggest, and what has worked for me in the past, is hiring someone through Fiverr or other freelance writing sites or freelance sites in general, and just having them for do like a small portion of your work and then seeing if you want to commit to more, like a portion that you think needs the most work, and then seeing if that really is right for you. If they're catching lots of mistakes, that should help. So there was one more thing I wanted to say about this. I don't think I'm remembering it. Oh, and no matter what, I really recommend you have a content or copy editor go over your query letter, your synopsis, and the first, that's my baby waking up, and the first 20 pages. If you can't afford for them to do the whole manuscript, at least get them to do that, because that is the part that must be polished and must be as perfect as possible. And I've actually gotten 2 or 3 to go over the last query letter I put together seriously, because I wanted it to be flaw-free and I wanted it to be really appealing. And someone in the questions, and Jacob answered this, but I'm going to answer it a little more thoroughly, said that you wanted to know if the contents of the course will be available from now on out. And we wish that it would, and it will be for at least 3 months. We're making sure of that, but we don't know exactly how Thinkific software will work in the long term and if it will always be available, but it will be available for the next 3 months for sure. But if you want to copy any content, just go about it for your records. So there's that. And so I have a question from Ashley, and it's about publisher and agent contracts. And I do talk about this a fair amount in the final week. I think in the second or final day. I'm pretty sure it's the second to last day, but it might be in the last day, the last lecture. But the idea is that I will put 2 links in the content bar at the end. I've already found them and got them all ready to go. And so they'll be in the little chat there. And they'll go into more detail about what I'm talking about. But the problem is that with most articles on this and most information out there is it's subject to change and it's not accurate in every situation. And you have to take those things into consideration. And also most of this advice is really broad, and people are really careful with what advice they give. And that's because they don't want to mislead you. Like even when one of the articles I'm going to share is written by a lawyer who specifically works in this area, but she says, obviously it's not legal advice because she's not actually looking at your contract specifically. So this is the best advice I can give. And I wish it could even be more concrete and more, like foolproof, but I don't want to send you in the wrong direction. And you have to remember that I'm not an agent and I'm not a lawyer. I'm just someone who's been around the publishing industry for a long time, and I've been a writer for a long time. So take that into consideration. One of the best things that happened to me as a writer was I went to this writing camp. This might not seem related, but it's about to be. When I was 14, and the person who was leading this writing camp is this wonderful Canadian author and poet and publisher named Beth Follett. And she told us how much an author made per book. And at 14, it really blew my mind. And it was really shocking for me, but it was great because later when I was in grad school and everyone else was having this shocking realization. I was like, oh, I learned that as a teenager. And I was so proud of myself. But it was just an accidental learning, not because I was wiser than anyone else. So on a major book, like something from HarperCollins, you usually get 10% of net of gross. And so what that means in the contract is gross is before expense and net is after. So gross is definitely preferable to net generally. It depends a little on the percentage, of course. Most traditional publishers, they give you 10% off gross. And this is just the big five. With huge, really well-selling authors like J.K. Rowling, they can negotiate, they can get better deals. But this is just generally across the board. So if a book is worth $10, they would get 50 cents of that. If the book is worth $20, then they would get $1 of that. And so it can go up to 20%. That is not like completely without reason, but it's still a really small percentage of the money that's being made off of the book. And so with lots of ebooks, this percentage margin is going up, and the same with small presses. They tend to give a better margin, but of course you're selling less books usually. And so generally a small press contract, you will get 30 to 50%, and generally that is off net, so after the expenses. So gross, the range is usually 10 to 30%, and then off net it's 30 to 50%. Those are pretty standard. Of course, there's exceptions to that, but that's the general rule. So the other good things to look for in a contract is that it's not too long. If it's really long, they're probably trying to hide something in all the legalese, and it's not a good sign. Make sure. So one of the things that happens is when someone finally finds an agent, they usually, like, if you do good research, you're much more likely to not have to worry about all of this. Like, this is much more likely to be taken care of. If your research is really good, you're not going to be surprised by a terrible contract the same way that it might happen if you don't research beforehand. Especially with forums like Obsolete Rights, and it's why I promote it so much, the water cooler there, because people are giving real-time updates on what agents are currently doing, and they're holding them accountable in a public way. And it's really helpful that this is happening, and this is happening in a long, ongoing way. And I think it's one of the ways that the internet has improved our lives. So one of the things you should do is that usually when people are really happy to find an agent and they want to give that agent everything and cement a future relationship with that agent, but that's not always for the best. Might not be right for you. It might not be right for the agent. It really might not be right for your work. So it's really important with both publishers and agents to make sure that the agent or the publisher is, you're not obligated to give them future work or first pass at future work. You don't want to be stuck in that sort of contract, especially if your work does well. That could be really bad for you, and it's not good to be locked into that sort of contract, especially initially. The other thing is that they have limited rights in terms of time. Like, you don't give them rights for the rest of your life. You give them, usually a standard publishing contract is 3 to 5 years. And with an agent, it tends to have a different range. But it's really important to have time limits on these sort of things, because then if an agent isn't really working to promote your work, or they're not finding a placement for them, you can try again with another agent, for example. Or if the publisher, your book does really well, or it doesn't, but you don't feel like the publisher is really doing it a good any service, you want to get it back. And you also should look at the termination rights, like how much would you owe them if you had to terminate the contract? How much would they owe you if they did? Like, look into these sort of things. These are really important to know and research. It's also important to know the geographic limits of the rights, and also that you're not signing over, like, to a publisher specifically. Things like movie rights or TV rights, this should belong to you. An agent, that's different. They'll represent you in this sort of thing. And one of the really important things to know in a contract is that an agent shouldn't get paid until you get paid. which means that an agent should be paid off your royalties or advances. But yes, that's when an agent should be paid. You should not be paying them outright. So guest 1195, I'm sorry, I don't know your actual name, is feedback, asked this question. Feedback from you and from one of our classmates with whom I'm sharing work suggests that it is difficult to focus on who my main character is in the first 20 pages. I am wondering if we should focus on, I was wondering if we should focus on one character more than we will in the actual story. Make a slightly different 20 pages in the real story, or does it mean our 20 pages really should be different now in the query letter and later in the actual novel? So here's the thing, the feedback that you're getting from the reader and the feedback that you're getting from me. And if you have more readers, like that would help. But if we're consistent, that's usually a sign that any reader getting your novel would have that sort of reaction to it. And so because of that, I would suggest that you not put together a special 21st pages for this publisher to see, but fix the fundamental problem with it. And I don't, because this could actually be applicable to more than one manuscript, this course. So I don't know which manuscript you're talking about. But the thing is, you have to change that problem. You have to fix it. And once you fix it, it should be reflected throughout the rest of the novel. And so it should all be integrated together, and it should be the one the publisher sees. Because the thing is, most readers will not get past the first 20 pages if that's like a big misstep or a big cause of confusion. Even if it's really compelling, if it sends them off in the wrong direction, they will probably not pursue it further. That's why I think the first 20 pages are a really good guide in terms of going forward, because it's not just the publishers. Like, a lot of people complain about it. They're like, no one knows my novel from the first 20 pages. And it's true, but most people will not go past 20 pages of the novel. I am an exception. I will almost always completely read a book, even if I hate it. Even if I hate the first 20 pages, even if I hate the first 40 pages, even if I hate the first 60 pages. 1,000 Autumns of Jacob de Zoet is the only book I've read where I got 200 pages in and was like, oh my gosh, this is suddenly awesome. I love this. Everyone should read this. All the other books that I hated in the beginning, I hated in the end, pretty much. So yeah, I should have learned by now, but I can't. Once I start something, I commit to it and I keep going. So I really think that when we're telling you to make these changes in the first 20 pages, it's not just for the publisher's benefit or the agent's benefit, but it's this idea that it will actually benefit the book as a whole. Hopefully that was helpful. So guest 1195 asks also, is it okay to correspond with both an agent and a publisher at the same time, unless they specifically prohibit it or tell you not to? Go ahead. That's fine to submit to both at the same time. And you say, I felt that just going for an agent was enough, but with all your information about our responsibility at helping to promote our own work, I feel a bit torn about what is ethical and respectful. Okay, so I think I might have caused some confusion here, but not intentionally, I assure you. So usually when I pursue an agent and a publisher, if the publisher said yes, I would stop pursuing the agents. I would be perfectly happy with that publisher going forward. I would not go and get an agent. I would not suddenly turn around to the agents and say, see, I have a publisher, sign me. Although they might, because that's been my experience, is so that the friends of mine that have found publishers that they weren't 100% happy with in terms of the contract would then find agents to represent them. And the agents were much more interested because they already had this contract on the line. So it can work that way. And it's not unethical at all, as long as you're being upfront with everyone involved. And most publishers assume you're also submitting to agents. And most agents assume you're submitting to other agents at the same time, and maybe publishers. So it's not like you're violating anyone's trust, unless they say no simultaneous submissions. But as long as that's not on the board, you're fine ethically and morally. And I don't think in terms of promoting your own work, that like just pursuing, if it's just about getting published, I think it should be about getting published by the right person. Like I really feel strongly about submitting this novel in progress I'm working on to Anasazi Press in Canada. But that's not going to stop me from looking for agents while I'm waiting to hear back from them if they take a long time. I'm just going to do both, and they're fine with that, and everyone is fine with that. But I wouldn't pursue an agent if they said yes to me. I would sign the contract and we would go on our merry way, and it would all be done. But first I have to finish this book. But the point is this, that I don't think, when I say that it's really important to promote our own work, I don't necessarily mean, like, it's important to submit, but I don't think that submitting to publishers and agents at the same time necessarily ups your chances. Like submitting to 5 agents is just as good an opportunity as submitting to, say, 3 agents and 2 publishers. What I mean by that is just connecting with the community, putting yourself out there by going to conferences, supporting other writers, all that sort of thing is really important and part of how getting published works. It's not just the switch we turn on. It's all these like incremental steps that we take over years. Modupe, I'm sorry, I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce your name, but that's an excellent question. They just asked, what does it mean if a publisher says, if accepted, we take first print and electronic publishing rights? So every publisher will ask for this. It is totally normal and totally okay. I mean, some will just ask for electronic rights, and some might just ask for print rights, but that's very unusual now. They'll probably ask for first print and electronic rights. And all that means is that they are going to be your first publisher. After that, it's reprints. But the thing is, they can't not take first print and electronic rights if you haven't published it before. So for the Poetry Marathon, which is this event we run, we always take first print and electronic publishing rights, because even if we didn't take those, anyone submitting that had already been published in that, all the other journals would automatically consider them published by us, even if we didn't technically take those rights. I hope that explains it. But it's something that as soon as your thing is printed, even if it's just by you up on the internet in general, it's considered published. Like it's so, for example, when someone publishes on Kindle, for example, they like to think that it's still in their control, but no, it's out on the internet and it's with Amazon, and they can take it down at any time, but there's no way to get those first print publication rights back. You've given them away to yourself and to Amazon in a way, once you've put it up there. And trying to erase that history isn't ethical. And I have known authors who've gotten caught in that. They also ask, should there be a time limit for the electronic publishing rights? Yes, it should be the same sort of concrete time limit for the print rights. And that way, like, you can renegotiate the contract if it's not favorable to you, all that sort of things. If they stop really promoting it, anything like that, you should be getting your rights back in within a certain period of time. Any other questions? It's been about 30 minutes, which is about as long as I usually do my office hours for. And I'm sorry for the crying baby in the background. I'm hoping the mic didn't pick it up terribly. We're still adjusting to the time zone change. We're back in Toronto, which means there's a 3-hour time zone change, and the kids are doing pretty good, but not 100%. And if I don't have any more questions, I'm going to bid you all a really good night. And I want to say before I go, this course has been really wonderful to teach, and I've really loved the manuscripts I've read in it and the variety. And I have to say that the research assignments this quarter have just been beyond impressive. Like, I kept thinking, wow, I have never seen something this in depth in terms of research. I mean, there's still some people who didn't do as much research, but some people put together huge, long, incredible files. And even the people who put together short things did a really great job in terms of who they listed. And I was just really impressed by the caliber of that and also of the manuscripts. So thank you, everyone, for showing up. And thank you for making this class so great for me. And I really look forward to keeping in touch and reading your writing. And I wish you all the best luck. And if anything ever gets published, please tell me. And I would love to celebrate with you and brag about it and be really happy for you. So yeah, keep me updated. Thank you all. Good night.